From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there. Welcome to Chicago Newsroom here on Can TV. I'm Ken Davis with another program here and welcoming you and saying, hey, hope you like our new environment here on Channel 27. Doesn't it feel more expansive on Channel 27? I don't know. Maybe it does. On today's show, defending the police. Is policing as it currently exists inherently racist? Well, that's one of the perplexing questions that we're going to talk about a little bit here on the show today. Chicago police officers are asked to work in communities that have been racked by decades of poverty, disinvestment, predatory policies. And the police, when they work in these stressed neighborhoods, are often accused of disproportionately mistreating and sometimes killing people of color. But are they racist, or are they simply cleaning up the mess that decades of racist laws and business practices have caused? It's a pretty wrenching debate, and today we're going to hear from a forceful defender of the police through the writing of Maya Dukmasova. She spent a good deal of time working with talking to Dan Herbert. He's the go-to lawyer for so many of the Chicago police officers, including, we should mention, Jason Van Dyke, who fired the famous 16 shots. So Maya, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here. Now as a full-time writer for the Chicago Reader, happy to hear that.
Thank you.
It's good for you. So I saw this and thought, we have to sit and talk about this, although it's good. This is going to be an unconventional show for us in a lot of ways, just because it's hearsay. I mean, it's like we're talking to you about the things, the conversation that you had with an interesting guy. But I had never heard of Dan Herbert before I read the story, and you spent a lot of time with him, apparently.
Yeah, and I bet now, after you've read the story, you're going to start noticing his name everywhere, because
absolutely
he gets mentioned once a week, and at least on WBZ and in the Tribune and in the Sun-Times. But yeah, he represents a lot of police officers who are accused of misconduct in criminal proceedings, in civil litigation, and in administrative hearings with the police department as well. And he's kind of a jack of all trades when it comes to serving police officers legal issues. So people come to his firm with divorce cases, with personal injury cases, but the thing that really gets the spotlight on him are these kind of visible, egregious misconduct cases in which officers, shoot someone, kill someone, abuse someone, and he's the criminal defense attorney.
So I have to just talk to you as a reporter for a second. What gave you the idea? I mean, it turned out to be a great story, but it's not something that you would just conventionally think of. Did you just see his name and say, I got to find out who this guy is?
Yeah. So I think I started noticing at some point in the fall, maybe in September or October, around the time, actually, Marco Proano, who is a police officer who is now facing federal charges for firing his gun into a car full of unarmed teenagers.
Well, I think we all remember that video.
Yeah, and so our reader, Steve Bogira, did a whole long story about Proano, about a different case in which Proano had killed a young black man several years before the car incident. So in the fall, in September, Proano was charged with these federal charges, and I noticed that Dan Herbert was representing him, and I was like, isn't that Jason Van Dyke's lawyer? So then I started Googling him, and sure enough, I noticed, that he's popping up everywhere. Because, when it came to these very visible cases of officers accused of misconduct. So that's what sort of brought on the idea of doing a profile of him.
But this is not just an interview. This is not your classic interview where you spent an hour with somebody and then you came back and cut up the notes. I mean, you got into philosophical discussions with him about stuff. And you say in here that I can't remember exactly how you put it, but over several months of reporting. So
yeah.
Tell me about that.
So I began meeting with him in October, I think. Basically, I'd contacted him. I told him I'd wanted to write a profile of him. I sent him a couple of links to previous profiles I'd done just to kind of show what kind of work I do. And he was open to it, and he was very generous with his time. And basically, I went to court with him for one of Jason Van Dyke's hearings in the beginning, for one of Proano's, and then we would speak in his office, for maybe an hour after each of those, and then like maybe 2 or 3 more times I like made appointments to go and speak to him in his office. One time he let me come and like watch a staff meeting at the office. That didn't make it into the story, but he was just very kind of open and generous with his time and open to letting me hang around and see how he works.
Now, on several occasions, he makes it very clear that his view is that police themselves are not racist. I mean, we can pull the quotes from it, but it's very interesting to me that he is a former police officer,
Yeah.
and he kind of begins from the premise that police officers that it's not a systemic racism that causes these things to happen.
Yeah, and I mean, during the course of our discussions, it became clear that he didn't really. This idea that the police themselves are not racist is not unique to him. Like, this is I think, a pretty widely held view by, I would say, probably most white people anyway, that the individual cops are not out to do any harm to anyone, that they're well-intentioned people trying to do their jobs, and they're not individually racist. And what sort of became clear to me during the course of our discussions is that when people, police reform advocates, protesters, talk about structural or systemic racism in the police department, Herbert and other people don't really know what that means. Like, he didn't understand, and he said it himself, like, when Lori Lightfoot said that the police department, there's institutional racism in the police department.
In the accountability task force.
Yeah, she was the chair of the police board and was also heading up the police accountability task force last April when the report was released. And one of the things that was out there, one of the conclusions was that there's institutional racism in the police department. And Dan himself says, that to me, that meant that Lori Lightfoot called my dad a racist. And this is how a lot of other police officers took it, because his father was also a police officer, right? So they took it very personally, and so this is something that I think is really important to for everyone in this discussion to kind of understand, is that folks in the cops' shoes, or who are advocates for the cops, not necessarily that they don't necessarily know or understand what structural racism means, because they've never had to think about it most of the time. So that was kind of the point of highlighting those discussions in the story.
I found that really fascinating, and it sounds like you actually got into some conversations, just real conversations with him about that.
Yeah.
And there were points where he appeared to sort of concede some things to you about that too. Did you expect that you would be having more of a conversation than an interview?
Well, that was the goal, because I think that when you're writing a profile, like, a lot about a person gets revealed in the course of a conversation, much more than like bullet point Q&A. So I really wanted to get at his true understanding and feeling about things. And of course, like, a lot of the conversation is also structured by the fact that he has this job as an advocate for his clients. So like, when we're talking about specific cases of his in which his clients seem to like very clearly be engaging in personal racist acts, like, he has a very hard time speaking openly about that. I don't know what he might believe, deep down about them, but it was a long process to get him to say, for example, that like, if there's a famous, infamous photo of 2 Chicago police officers with a black man, and the police officers are decked out in hunting gear and have rifles, and the black man is on the ground, with his tongue out and with deer antlers taped to his head. And this photo surfaced during the course of the investigation of Jerome Finnegan, who was one of the men in the photo. Herbert represented the other man in the photo, the other police officer in the photo, after the photo was surfaced, and that officer, then detective, was fired. So basically, when it came to discussing that instance, that particular person, Herbert conceded that if truly the man in the photo with the antlers was an arrestee, then it's possible that, his client had done something racist. But in those conversations, I was always aware that this is somebody who represents his clients. So he's sort of in a bind to advance the most charitable interpretation of their actions. But when we were talking more generally about race and racism and what the critiques are of the police out there, I was much more interested in getting to the bottom of his understanding of what people mean when they say the police are racist.
And that's part of what we were talking about, I guess, in the introduction here, is the idea that as you've written, he argues that the reason there are so many black people caught up in the criminal justice system isn't because of their race, but because they come from neighborhoods with higher rates of poverty and therefore higher crime rates. So if the police are disproportionately arresting people of color, it's not because they are racist in his view, it's because they're working in neighborhoods where there is more crime.
Right, but he himself traces the roots of criminal activity in poverty, and then he goes on to acknowledge that it's African Americans who have been disproportionately impoverished by various government policies. So the fact that it's African American communities that are poor, where there's higher crime, he understands that as not some accident. It seemed to me that he understands that them being African American and being in this situation, it has everything to do with their race. But then the next step to say that, okay, the police are another arm of the state, which in all other aspects disproportionately negatively impacts African Americans. The police too, the police may do good things, they may do bad things, but it's the poor African American communities that disproportionately get the sore end of the deal when it comes to policing. But he was much more, I guess, reluctant to go there, to talk about how policing is an extension of the same problem of discrimination and oppression that gets perpetrated through other branches of the state.
You begin your piece with a scene at the courthouse where Jason Van Dyke is I guess it was an early pre-trial meeting of some sort. Where are we at with Jason Van Dyke? What is the chronology on that?
Yeah, so the latest is that Dan and his team, there are several other attorneys on the defense team, have filed 2 separate motions to dismiss the murder charges against Van Dyke. And
we should say Jason Van Dyke, of course, is the guy who shot 16 times, who killed Laquan McDonald. I think it's not in dispute that he killed Laquan McDonald.
Yeah. So the 2 motions to dismiss the murder charges that Dan filed, one of them argues that there are these federal civil rights laws that protect public employees from incriminating themselves when they're being investigated by their employers. So they're called Garrity rules. And basically, it's so that public employees are never in a situation where they have to choose between their job and a criminal prosecution. So one of the motions to dismiss the murder charges argues that basically, because things that Van Dyke said during the investigation by the police department, his employer, were then used against him for pressing charges, during the grand jury process to actually indict him, that those things should not have, that information from his conversations with the police department should not have been used against him in the criminal matters. So that's one of the that's like one of the arguments to dismiss the murder charges. And the second one is separate, and basically he claims that the Cook County State's Attorney did not properly instruct the grand jury in how they're supposed to consider the charges against Van Dyke, because they rushed to try to get the indictment and basically, as Dan put it in court, to like sacrifice Jason Van Dyke to the angry mob outside. So at this point in March, at some point, there's going to be another date at which the judge will, I guess, decide whether or not he allows the defense team to argue these motions. And after that, there'll be another court date in which the defense team will actually argue their motions in open court. And then I guess I don't know if the judge will decide on that same date or take another period of time to decide to rule how to rule on the motions. So we're months. It's going to be many more months.
And there's also that other thing about he's trying to get the records from Laquan McDonald's youth, whatever his engagement was with public service agencies. And
he is, so the judge did allow the defense team access to those records. However, at the latest court date in February, there was some problem with the records actually getting transferred to the defense team. So there's some sort of like paperwork or like bureaucratic issue, and the judge is getting very annoyed that like things have not been turned over in a timely manner. So there's also the issue of like city emails pertaining to the shooting, where the CPD leadership and I guess maybe the mayor, whoever like in the city leadership was having an email discussion about this. So the defense team wants all those emails, and it's like thousands of pages of emails, and all of this has to be like transferred and decoded, and I don't know. It's a whole long, complicated process.
I'm a little confused as to why the record of his youth engagement is germane here, because okay, so he was a troubled youth. I mean, that doesn't necessarily impinge on that engagement that he had where he got out of the car and shot him. I mean, that's a thin line to me to be able to.
That has to do with an Illinois Supreme Court decision the case was called the People versus Lynch, and so if you were arguing self-defense in a murder case in Illinois, you basically can use the past acts and character of the victim to justify killing the victim in self-defense. So Jason Van Dyke didn't have to know Laquan McDonald or know anything about his past, but if Laquan McDonald was the sort of person that had a propensity to violence, then the jury can have a right to know that information and basically decide whether Laquan McDonald was the kind of person who could pose a threat. So this is called, so because of this case, this is called lynch material by lawyers. So if this information about a person's past that seemingly has nothing to do with the actual circumstance of the killing, this lynch material can be pertinent to a self-defense argument.
We don't need to adjudicate the Laquan McDonald thing here, but I find that just really fascinating. I mean, his engagement with Laquan McDonald was all of 30 seconds long. He had never seen him. He knew nothing about him. It wasn't like he recognized him and said, "Oh, that's a troublemaker." I mean, he just got out of the car and, as far as we can see from the video, just started shooting.
But he's been
anyway.
Well, because he's been saying from the get-go that that Laquan McDonald somehow he felt threatened. If they can establish this sort of connection that Laquan McDonald could have been a threatening person, then it could, I guess, work in their favor.
Very interesting. And there are so many other issues that go around all of this. I found it really interesting where he talks about, as you said, he talks about the Accountability Task Force and about the DOJ report and everything. Are you hearing anything new about what's going on with the DOJ? The last we heard, they may or may not be sending somebody to Chicago to meet with the mayor. It seems unlikely that they would do my mind just went blank. A consent decree. What are you hearing?
Not much, really. It seems that there was some talk about some sort of negotiating team coming from the DOJ, but I haven't heard any updates about that. And given how long it took to confirm Jeff Sessions, I think that it's probably going to be, another month before all of the leadership positions within the department are probably solidified and all the new mandates trickle down to the various offices and branches of the DOJ. So I don't expect there to be, a team of negotiators coming from Washington any day to talk about a consent decree. And I mean, Jeff Sessions has been pretty clear that he's not a fan of consent decrees.
Right.
So with this new Attorney General, I really don't know how likely it is that negotiation will actually happen.
And then we have the new wrinkle that we have a new chief lawyer in Chicago, Mr. Siskel, and we don't really know how that's going to work. But I mean, I'm guessing that couldn't the city of Chicago kind of create its own consent decree just in-house, just say here are the things that we agree we're going to do, and then sign a piece of paper, just like a deal with itself.
Yeah, but that's like somebody self-regulating. I don't know how much change we could really expect from an agreement in which the people that are supposed to change are supposed to monitor themselves and hold themselves accountable. I don't think there's a lot of faith in the city that that all of this could be accomplished. Any kind of meaningful police reform could be accomplished without meaningful outside kind of supervision. But with that being said, there's a great deal of reform-oriented grassroots activism in the city, and a lot of people in that scene never had any faith in the federal government really helping any kind of serious reform efforts. So I think that this is also that what's happened on the national stage has really energized a kind of a base here in the city to really do everything that's possible locally to create an accountability structure and really take the police department to task.
We had Jamie Calvin on the show just very recently talking about Code of Silence, and he, I think I can paraphrase him, he said that he was kind of pleasantly surprised to see the Accountability Task Force report, that it went further than he had expected that it would. But then on the other hand, we had Lori Lightfoot on a couple of weeks ago too, and she's very unhappy with the level of compliance with the report, that the mayor went a certain distance and then seems to have just kind of stopped dead in the water. So I mean, it's not fair to ask you this, but I'll ask anyway. Do you get any sense at all that the fifth floor is willing to move forward on some of these reforms, or are they going to just kind of play it safely with as much politics as they can get away with?
I mean, I suppose I'd probably venture to guess the latter, but I really don't know. I don't have any inside channels into the fifth floor, but
none of us do.
I do get the sense that a lot of the reforms and changes that were introduced between basically, when the video of Laquan McDonald being killed was surfaced and the DOJ report actually coming out, it seems like there was a lot of city movement, in anticipation of what could happen with the DOJ, to get ahead of the DOJ's recommendations or a potential consent decree. And at one point, I remember over the summer, there was a meeting about IPRA reform, and Lori Lightfoot spoke at this meeting. This was a big community meeting at Malcolm X College, and during her remarks at one point, she basically referred to the consent decree as all but inevitable. And I think no one really at that point could guess what was coming during the election. And it seems like there was a lot of activity and a lot of kind of changes promised, and some things even, perhaps accomplished. Until we got what we got with the election, and now maybe the city's pulling back because they know that the DOJ isn't coming down here with their lawyers.
Yeah. And by the way, as long as we're talking about the Jamie Calvin thing, I found it just so fascinating to have these two things crash together with your piece on Mr. Herbert and how he shows up in. I mean, Well, we did a long conversation about code of silence and how there were these essentially police-run gangs in the high-rises before they came down Stateway Gardens and so forth. And it was told from the perspective of one police officer, one woman who was a whistleblower, and all the horrible things that happened to her because she was. And then we see that Dan Herbert, in your story, he shows up in that story because he was kind of injected into the whole thing at the last, well, not at the last minute, but I mean, I don't know if there's a way to summarize it quickly, but he shows up in that story.
Yeah. Shannon Spalding, the whistleblower, had contacted him when she initially decided to file the lawsuit against various CPD top brass for retaliating against her and her partner for investigating this police corruption. And she had known him because he had been, working at the FOP and I think he may have represented her on some matter before as an FOP lawyer. And so she didn't really know anybody else, and she went to him, and that's how they got involved. And eventually she went with a different lawyer because she felt like Dan was not truly representing her interests, and that instead he was kind of guided in his work by these relationships within the police department that really compromised his integrity as a lawyer on her case. So
interesting, very interesting stuff. I promised myself I was going to ask you this one other question just at the end here. We're down to the last minute or so, but do you have any guidance for me? I am asking everybody about this idea that the mayor and the police superintendent and Kwame Raoul and everybody, they're all saying one of the big things we need is to have more gun laws that would get people off the streets for repeat offenses and so forth. Do you believe that would make a difference?
No, not while there are this many guns on the streets, because there's going to be an endless number of people who are going to, those guns are going to fall into an endless number of hands, and the people involved in these shootings, especially now, are very, very young kids, are very young people who we don't even necessarily hear about because they might wind up in the juvenile justice system after involvement in some sort of shooting. So I think that harsher punishment for gun offenses is not not going to fix the root cause of this problem. This is a poverty issue first and foremost, and so the conversation has to start with what to do about improving life circumstances in these neighborhoods. And
it wouldn't just, we only have a couple of seconds, but it wouldn't just get troublemakers off the street?
I think that's too late to intercede, to put someone in jail. By the time that somebody actually gets involved in a shooting, I think at that point, there's been multiple stages at which the institutions in the city have failed them. So
it's an ongoing conversation. It'll never end. Maya, I'm so happy you came today. I really appreciate you talking to us. Now, this is not on the newsstands anymore, but you can get it online. It's the guy defending all the cops. That's what it's called. Look it up. You'll really enjoy it. I promise you, it's good reading. Maya Dukmasova is a reporter and writer for The Reader, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
All right. We'll talk to you again soon on another edition of Chicago Newsroom. Remember, you can see any of our shows right here by going to this address. Watch us on YouTube and listen to us on SoundCloud, too. We're on SoundCloud now. You can hear all of our shows, the audio portion of the show. It's good radio, you know? Hey, we'll see you next time. Thanks very much. I'm Ken Davis. See you next week. Bye-bye.